Hello, this is Rudy Giuliani, and I'm back with another episode of Rudy's Common Sense. Today, we are going to look at the Israeli-Hamas conflict from a deeper point of view. One maybe you haven't heard before, and one that is at the core of what is really going on. Because the only way you can solve a problem of this magnitude is to truly understand it, and not to be basically swinging at windmills that are just substitutes for the real problem. The Palestinian-Israeli war, conflict, or better described as the Israeli-Hamas conflict, appears to have begun pretty simply, and all the narratives, all the chronologies, on May 8th, 2021. And it seems it is a dispute between Hamas, Palestinian Authority on the one hand, and Israel on the other. But if it's viewed just on the surface of what we see and what is presented to us, as it is by the Biden administration, it seems, and the Democrat American media and the world media, which is left of left and instinctively anti-Israel, anti-United States, anti-Western civilization, whatever the outcome, the real party and interest here is going to win. It's either going to win big or it's going to win. So it's important to go further than the superficial, rather inept Biden administration is capable of going, and their press acolytes. What I'm about to describe and explain to you almost cannot be accepted by the Biden administration because it would contradict and prove the fallacy of at least their last 10 or 15 years of foreign policy with regard to Iran, originally begging them for the 2015 nuclear treaty, which resulted in their giving billions to Iran, and with no explanation of what that money was used for. The media, owned and operated by the Democratic Party, covers up for anything Democrats want to do, and somehow they found a rationalization for the billions that were given to the regime of terror, the regime that sponsors terrorism all throughout the world. If it sponsors terrorism all throughout the world, then is it a simple conclusion that a lot of that billions and billions and billions went to terrorists? So in essence, is it hard to come to the conclusion that Obama sponsored terrorism? Now we're going to see the results of that Obama investment in the regime of terror. This war is a proxy war. This is a war in which Hamas and the Palestinian Authority are standing in for Iran so that they can do damage to Israel as much as possible. But more importantly, they can show, display, illustrate the vulnerabilities of the state of Israel to a sophisticated attack, much more sophisticated attack than Palestinian Authority would have been capable of without the arms and, more importantly, the training of the Iranians in the use of these much more sophisticated, longer-range missiles that Palestine never had before, or never had the money to buy. You know, it reminds me of the scene in Godfather 1 when Don Corleone is leaving the commission meeting with his lawyer Hagen, and they're sitting in the back of the car. It's kind of a dark scene, and we'll play a little of it for you. A little hard to see, but here's what he says to his lawyer, who just sees, like Biden does on the surface, that this was a war between the Tartaglia family and the Corleone family. And that's what Hagen says. And the wise old Don, nearing the end, says to his consigliere, quote, "Tartaglia is a pimp. He never could have outfought Santino, but I didn't know until this very day it was Barzini all along." Now just listen to it. Marlon Brando does it better.
When I meet with the Tattaglia people, should I insist that all these drug middlemen have clean records?
Mention it. Don't insist. Bazzini's the man who'll know that without being told.
You mean Tattaglia?
Tattaglia's a pimp. He never could have outfought Santino. But I didn't know until this day that it was Bazzini all along.
Now, if you think I'm making too much of this, there's a September 8th, 2013 article by Ben Hunt in Ypsilon Theory, which actually uses this scene as a very intricate example of internal emerging markets analysis and how you can make mistakes by not realizing who's actually behind the deal. And you've got to spend time trying to discover who's behind the deal. But of course, we have spent no time exploring who's behind this deal because we don't want to know. Because Biden and the lefties want to make some kind of an agreement again with the regime of terror. They want to load them down with money, and they want to give them a 10-year path to being a nuclear power because they're, I guess, such a responsible country. So just substitute Hamas for Tattaglia and the Islamic Republic of Iran for Barzini, and it would read something like this. This would be the analysis that the president really needs from somebody who understood foreign policy, which he doesn't have around him, free of all kinds of illusions and silly ideas and ivory tower theories. Here's a simple analysis for the president. Hamas is a pimp. They never could outfight Israel. What I didn't know until this very day, it was Iran all along. Or substitute, it was the Ayatollah all along. Or it was the regime of terror all along. Ben Hunt goes on to write, once Vito understood why Philip Tartaglia was coming after him, like he was just a stooge for Emilio Barzini, everything changed for the Corleone family. You think Biden will have that wisdom? Now recognizing that it's Iran behind this? And everything will change for the United States? Or you think maybe Vito Corleone had more insight than Joe Biden? He was a horrible, horrible killer. Doesn't mean he wasn't smart. But what ultimately saved the Corleone family, Hunt goes on, wasn't just the observation of Barzini's underlying causal influence. It was the strategy that adjusted to the new reality of why. Can Biden adjust this failed strategy? It is now clearly a failed strategy. Everything that's taken place in the last week proves it in headlines bigger than any newspaper could write, in headlines that are being avoided by the corrupt media and the Iran-loving Western Europe. So let's see if we can find the proof so that these unrealistic lefties can't run away from the truth, although they spend most of the time doing that. And we do hope the Biden family can exercise the flexibility that the Corleone family exercised, change strategy, and save the family. Now it's time to take a short break. I accomplished a lot in 2020 exposing the truth, establishing the relationship with you, working tirelessly for America. And I came to know the work and value of the people at American Hartford Gold. You see, you buy gold not only for what you know, but you buy gold for what you don't know. American Hartford Gold is the company you can trust when it comes to buying gold. They sell physical gold and silver delivered right to your door or inside of your IRA. In the precious metals industry, they are the highest rated firm in our country with an A+ from the Better Business Bureau and thousands of satisfied clients. Give them a call and tell them Rudy sent you. And be sure to ask them what I bought. And if you call them right now, they will give you up to $1,500 of free silver on your first order. Folks, these are uncertain times. The one thing you can count on to protect what you have worked so hard for is physical gold and silver. So don't wait. Call them now. Call 833-GOLD-777. That's 833-GOLD-777. Or text Rudy to 65532. Again, that's 833-GOLD-777. Or text Rudy to 65532. Thank you for returning. There's a lot to ask of a president who is suffering from clearly some form of significant cognitive impairment, and from someone whose advisors have been clearly conned by Iran into, just a few years ago, giving Iran, the biggest state sponsor of terrorism, billions of dollars without asking any questions. It would take a massive admission of being completely wrong about the regime of terror for decades. That includes the State Department, the Deep State, the CIA, the Obama administration, and now the Obama II administration, nominally called the Biden administration. But the safety and security of our ally, the State of Israel, and the safety and security of our people hangs in the balance of making correct strategic decisions and not being outmaneuvered, outthought, and outstrategized by your enemy, which now we are. You can't look at the Biden administration's response to this and see in it any kind of competence. He didn't seem to know what was going on for 4 days. He didn't make a statement for 4 days. He hasn't appointed an ambassador to the State of Israel. He hasn't appointed a council to the State of Israel. It's as if it doesn't exist. Wish it away, Joe. Is that part of the illness? Trump appointed his ambassador to Israel, I believe, a month before the inauguration. Obama the day after the inauguration. We're well into 100 days now. I don't know if somebody's been named. It'd be impossible not to conclude that on this one, they were asleep at the switch and they're fumbling and making terrible mistakes along the way. But let's look at the history of Iran, Palestinian Authority, Hamas, and the various groups that are there. Because there is a history that we avoid. There is a history we don't tell. There is a history we close our eyes to because it prevents us from reaching the flawed policy decisions we seem so fond of. At least when I say we, I mean our left-wing officials who dominate the State Department in Republican or Democrat administration. For years, for decades, the regime of terror has been supporting Hamas, despite the differences between Hamas and Hezbollah. Our diplomats, foreign policy analysts, and the denizens of the deep state can't seem to get beyond the fact that, they can be pretty comfortable that Hezbollah won't work with Hamas because Hamas is Sunni and Hezbollah is Shiite. But Iran was funding Palestine despite that. We can date it back at least to 1987, when Iran not only funded, to some extent, but trained Islamic Jihad, the PIJ. Islamic Jihad is an organization that predates probably Hamas, and they started their organizational operations with a great deal of support from Iran in 1986, 1987, because they saw a community of interest with regard to the Islamic Revolution, and they saw the state of Israel as a major, major obstacle in Iranian hegemony in the region. And then, when Hamas came along, they began funding Hamas. In 1993, Iran publicly pledged $30 million in annual support to Hamas, to their anti-Israeli offensive. So we can't say we're not aware of this. That's a long time ago, and that's a lot of money in those days. So back in 1993, we have Iran making substantial investments in Hamas, and specifically in their effort to overthrow the state of Israel. There was a separation for some time between Hamas and Hezbollah, because originally Iran used Hezbollah for the transmission of the money, the transmission of the know-how, the transmission of the material, the transmission of the help they needed, even in strategizing. But with the war in Syria and Assad's virtual genocide, I mean, the slaughter of his own people, it turned Hamas off because they are Sunnis, and their people were being slaughtered in the thousands, hundreds of thousands, and who knows, maybe even more. I mean, he wiped out a good deal of his population with the help of Iran, and really operationally with Hezbollah. So that put a barrier between the two. But it didn't interrupt Iran's continued support of Hamas for its objective to destroy Israel. They can compartmentalize. They're very, very adept terrorists. And they weren't going to let this dispute get in the way of their dream of an empire in the Middle East, a Persian empire again. And they're getting there, right? Iraq, Syria, take in the Palestinian Authority, destroy the state of Israel. Who knows, maybe you can cave in a couple of those Arab states. You got quite a little empire there with the support, maybe not 100%, but pretty solid support of Russia and China. They're making big moves in that direction. I think we'll pause now and we'll be back in just a few minutes. Your credit card company found suspicious charges on your card. That's simple identity theft. It's annoying, but they cover it. The type of fraud you really need to worry about is home title theft, a devastating crime that takes you off your home's title. And you're not covered by insurance or most identity theft programs. That's why you need Home Title Lock. Here's how easy it is for cyber criminals to get you. The title documents to our homes are kept online. The thief forges your signature on a quitclaim deed stating you just sold your home, and he's the new owner. Then he borrows money using your home's equity and leaves you in debt. You won't know until late payment or eviction notices arrive. The instant Home Title Lock detects someone tampering with your home's title, they help shut it down. Let's get you protected. Go to HometitleLock.com and register your address to see if you're already a victim. And enter Rudy for 30 free days of protection. That's promo code Rudy at HometitleLock.com. Thank you for returning. But this division between Hamas and Hezbollah was troubling to Iran because it stood in the way of the much more important objective of Iranian control of the entire Islamic movement, which is what the Ayatollah and his madmen mullahs want. We can locate a meeting in October 2017 between Salah al-Aruri, Hamas's second in command, and he led a Hamas delegation to Tehran, and there he met with the infamous Quds Force commander Qasem Soleimani. And after several days of talks, Soleimani assured him that he had Iran's 100% support. And This is the same Soleimani that the Trump administration successfully eliminated. This is the same Soleimani that killed many, many Americans. It's the same Soleimani that Biden said he wouldn't kill. But of course, Biden's been wrong on foreign policy for the last 30 years, so why ever be right? Well, shortly after this meeting, really within days, if not a month of this meeting, Arori then traveled, probably at Soleimani's request, to meet with Hezbollah. And he met with the Secretary General of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah. And there are media reports of that. Both sides agreed to place their disagreements aside so that they could stand together for the purpose of destroying Israel. That is a very significant meeting that received very little attention. I imagine, and I believe within the Trump administration it was taken very seriously, but I'm sure the State Department has found all kinds of reasons to say that meeting really wasn't that important and it really wasn't that significant. Maybe never even took place. Well, I mean, this opened up a veritable blank check for Hamas, both for money, weapons, training, cooperation, not only from the regime of terror, but also from a much more skilled, much more sophisticated terrorist group, Hezbollah, that can do a lot more damage. And consistently throughout, Iran has supplied Hamas, and we've known it, with anti-tank munitions, with tanks, with IEDs, with training in modern warfare, most importantly, helping them acquire the much more sophisticated, longer-range missiles they were incapable of affording back in 2014. And not only that, didn't have the expertise to use these missiles. They had to be trained. So Iran has been there now for well on 2 decades, and in the last couple, really stepping up its efforts. Iran may be using Hamas, the Palestinian Authority, but they understand what the Biden administration and the left doesn't understand. The Palestinian Authority is dysfunctional. It doesn't work. They're not going to win a war. They can do a proxy war for you, where they can show you the vulnerabilities of the other side, and then you can come in with professionals and be a lot better off. But they're not going to win a war. This truly is, a pimp. But you use the pimp. Use the pimp to do the dirty work. Look for the vulnerabilities, see where they penetrated, and then you step in. Unlike the ivory tower idiots in the United States and Western Europe, Iran is not going to trust the Palestinian Authority to do anything serious. They're going to be there on top of them, watching and using them. Let them lose their lives. Let them do the sacrifices, if they're stupid enough to do it. After all, Tatalia was a pimp. They are so unsure of what they can really count on from the dysfunctional Palestinian Authority that they've actually built their own, now, terrorist organization, funded entirely by Iran and beholding directly to Tehran. It's called Al-Sabrin, and it operates in both Gaza and the West Bank. And when Hamas was declared a terrorist group by the Trump administration, so was Al-Sabrin. Pause and consider. Pause and consider for a moment. This is what the billions of dollars Obama gave Iran goes to fund. That country is starving. I've watched protests now for 2 years with people on the street selling internal organs for money in order to buy food. I don't know if you have any idea of the horrible conditions within Iran, and the street signs to depose the Ayatollah and his entire regime. Street signs that can earn you execution on the street. So they're pretty darn serious. we downplay that too. But they still can take billions of dollars from their people and use it to support Hezbollah, killing innocent people, to support Hamas, killing innocent people, and to support terrorist groups all around the world. You will get no objection from anyone to the following statement. Iran is the biggest state sponsor of terrorism in the world. Then why the hell would you give them money? Unless you want to support terrorism. Is that too logical for left-wing Democrats to accept? The genesis of this whole conflict, war, was allegedly Israel's rough treatment of the worshipers who went to the Al-Aqsa Mosque on one of the concluding days of Ramadan, May 8th, which is a particularly holy day. And then the second proximate cause, theoretically, was the approval by the court allowing some Palestinian families, or allowing for the eviction of some Palestinian families who lived in East Jerusalem. This was made into a massive issue, and very, very strangely, immediately led to a rocket attack within a few hours by Hamas. But let's take that apart too. What happened at the Al-Aqsa Mosque could have happened in any one of our countries. Israel, like so many countries in the West, in what is now, at this point, a hysterical reaction to CCP virus. You call it COVID. I call it Chinese Communist Party virus. Has a limit on gatherings. You could only have so many people in such gatherings. You know, we have those. We have them in churches, right? In fact, many people think it's discriminatory. Only 20%, only 50%, only 30%, only whatever. And Israel's had several breakouts of CCP virus. The limit for the Al-Aqsa Mosque gathering was 10,000. Seems like a pretty generous number. But in the days leading up to, and then on May 8th, they kept exceeding that limit, really basically trying to create a setup for police action. And finally, when it got to 30 or 40,000, the police came in, the police tried to take action, and violence broke out. And before you can say boo, rockets were falling on Israel. This was a setup. Are we stupid? You couldn't get those rockets ready in 2-3 hours. Figure out the targets, make the decision. This was a setup. I don't know how naive we are or pretend to be, but it's at a level now where it's dangerous to the safety and security of our country. Also, the corrupt media, basically hides all this. Makes it sound like the Israeli police had no reason to bother these poor worshiping Palestinians, even though it was 3 to 4 times the limit, which, my goodness, they think is almost sacred. Because, most of the media are COVID worshipers, and they worship at the religion of COVID. So, this kind of thing. Imagine if this was a bunch of white men. There's supposed to be only 10,000 and there were 30. Could be execution in America. Could be. But the genesis of this attack had nothing to do with this. The genesis of the attack may go back to our elimination of Soleimani. Iran, the regime of terror, has never felt that it's gotten proper vindication or revenge for the murder of really their most skilled assassin and warrior. Apparently, we're not going to get a break just because Biden opposed murdering Soleimani, as he did bin Laden. And wasn't Gates really right? Now think about this. Gates is a really smart man. He was a Secretary of Defense in both the Bush and the Obama administrations. And he said in his book, in 30 years, Joe Biden has not made a correct decision about foreign policy. Recently, since Biden's become a candidate or maybe elected, he's been asked if he sticks by it. And man, obviously a man of conviction. He said, yes, I stick by it. And he's adding, Biden now has added significantly to the list. More likely, the proximate cause of Iran's heavy involvement, planning involvement, desire to have a proxy war that it can use as a game plan. It was probably energized somewhat by the outage of the Natanz nuclear power plant. The Natanz nuclear power plant was enriching uranium. It was bringing in much more sophisticated equipment to do so, and all of a sudden, the power went out. The regime of terror has now found a suspect who's running, but they have attributed it to Mossad, which may or may not be true. There are off-the-record statements in Israeli newspapers suggesting that Mossad was responsible for it, but there's been no official confirmation. Iran says, on the one hand, this didn't do much damage to the nuclear program. On the other hand, they are squealing like stuffed pigs over what's happened, calling it an act of war, an act of terrorism, a terrible disruption, So clearly, a great deal of damage was done. And if it was the Mossad, you know it wasn't done for nothing. And you know a great deal of damage was done. And this, of course, follows on just last November, the killing of the mastermind of the covert Iranian nuclear program, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh. Now, this is a hard name to pronounce. I'll put it up on the screen. You see if you can pronounce it. Fakhrizadeh. Fakhrizadeh. Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, who was probably the person most responsible for the covert Iranian plan that was discovered twice in the earlier part of the 21st century by Iranian dissidents, and has been operating throughout. They haven't stopped once, and that's why all these inspections come back, not really able to inspect. I mean, 2015 agreement or not, money or not, they're marching ahead to become a nuclear power. This is the regime of terror. It's a regime that lies. It's a regime that cheats. It's a regime that kills. It's a regime that probably, aside from China, has taken more of its own people than any country on earth. And once again, the murder of the mastermind of the nuclear weapons program, the Iranian mastermind of the nuclear weapons program in last November, of course, it was attributed to Mossad. This one, there are no leaks. Mossad doesn't take credit for it, but we all have a right to our opinion. We don't necessarily have a right to express it in the United States, but we have a right to have it. Beyond the magnitude of these attacks on the regime's actual nuclear program, in other words, beyond the damage it did to the nuclear program, it did monumental damage to the obvious exposure of the vulnerability of Iran. This is a police state. This is a state in which you do the wrong thing, you get shot down on the street. I've seen it. I have access to a great deal of footage of what's going on inside Iran. So I've gotten to see the last 2 years of protests. I've gotten to see the regime's brutal reaction to it. And I've gotten to see how the people stand up to it. This penetration that was made by Mossad or someone unfriendly to the regime of terror in cutting off the plant, killing the architect. This is not exactly a very well-protected regime, is it? And when you consider they've done a good job, the press has, of covering up what I'm going to tell you now, I'm going to tell you more about in the future because you need to know this. For the last 2.5, 3 years, since President Trump gave his support to Iranian dissidents, which Obama refused to give, for which he should be ashamed. But as soon as Trump said these people are fighting for freedom, there hasn't been a week that's gone by where there hasn't been a serious protest most of which lead to significant violence. One point was up to 140 different cities in Iran, maybe every city in Iran, and multiple protests, and not from only political activists, from nurses, doctors, bus drivers, police. Some of it ideological, some of it oppression, and some of it just pure starving. The Trump sanctions crippled Iran. They basically were just Biden sanctions enforced, because Biden never really enforced them. Just a bunch of, what does Biden like to say? Malarkey. Trump enforced them and then increased them, and he had Iran spinning, going after one protest after another. Recognition that Hamas and much of the Palestinian Authority is a proxy for Iran is another reason, and do you need another reason, that there should be no ambiguity about where the United States stands in this conflict, where our best interests are aligned. But Biden's almost pathological obsession with wanting to make an agreement with Iran can be hard to dispel. I mean, he seems to have this desire to give him a lot of money, like the money that he and Obama released of billions in 2015. Money that is being used now to kill Israelis. I mean, and he gave the Palestinian Authority money just a month ago that surely is being used to kill Israelis. His dysfunctional thinking stands in the way of the United States taking the position that's in the best interest, not only of the state of Israel, but it's the best interest of our safety and security. There's no moral equivalency between the state of Israel, a developed nation, a nation of laws, and the terrorist, corrupt Palestinian Authority. Yet the American Secretary of State, Blinken, the other day said that Israel has a greater burden to avoid killing children than the Palestinians. What? It's the same burden? You're not supposed to commit murder. You're not supposed to kill children. Doesn't matter if you're an Israeli soldier, a Hamas terrorist, or a stand-in from one of the groups that Iran has brought in. How ridiculous to say that one has a greater burden than the other. Doesn't it betray the idiot moral equivalency you've created? Well, you don't really have to stretch too far really to see that moral equivalent. Biden is so careful to give these statements in which, yes, he supports the right of Israel to defend itself, but then he supports the fact that they should stop the hostilities. And then all by itself, the other day he said, both sides deserve peace. Well, of course, both sides deserve peace. But one side disturbed the peace. One side shot rockets and continues to into the other side. And continue 3,000 rockets. How do they deserve peace if they do that? How do they deserve peace if they align with the greatest sponsor of terrorism in the world? How do they deserve peace if they teach their children to hate Jews and hate Americans, to kill Jews and kill Americans? How do they deserve peace? If they train their children to be murderers? What's wrong with this administration? What's wrong with Biden? What's wrong with the Democrat Party? Why are they so insistent on making an agreement with one of the worst regimes maybe in the history of the world? The Ayatollah is a religious homicidal maniac. He's surrounded by mullahs equally evil and no different than out of control capos in an organized crime family. The mullahs aren't religious men, they're rich men. The Ayatollah is a rich man. But he doesn't see it. And neither does his clueless administration. As I said, he hasn't named an ambassador. He hasn't named a peace envoy. Trump did it a month before. Obama did it the day after. Would you say he's asleep at the switch? I don't know. It looks like he's asleep all the time. This is why the talk of a two-state solution has to go. This recognition that this is a proxy war for Iran has to destroy any notion of a two-state solution. America cannot create another terrorist state in the Middle East. America cannot create another state that hates America. America cannot create another state where they teach their children to kill Americans. America cannot create another state. We talk about extra burden for killing children that uses children as shields. So the first to die are the children. As a matter of public relations, stop this. Israel has a greater burden not to kill children. Israel doesn't put the children in front of a facility. It's Hamas. It's the Palestinian Authority. It's Iran. It's Hezbollah. There's such a difference between the two of them. So this has to stop. The dangerous notion of a two-state solution, which could lead to yet another terrorist state, adding to the regime of terror's empire, and possibly dooming Israel to extinction. Second, it has to end abruptly any negotiations that will in any way allow Iran ever to become a nuclear power, ever. Regimes led by insane people should not have nuclear capability. Is that such a difficult concept to get, Joe? The man is insane. The man is a massive killer of his own people and of Americans. He has a insane religious notion of death and martyrdom. You want to give him the ability to have nuclear weapons in 10 years, press little buttons? And you want to give him billions of dollars so he can carry on his terrorist activities that are going on right now? Come on. Come on, show something here. Show there's something left of your patriotism, something left of your caring for the American people, and not just political platitudes and political positioning and, who knows, making money for your family and all the things you've done throughout your life that are so disgraceful. Maybe you could redeem it by changing your position on Iran and basically saying, yeah, you'll get a one-state solution, Palestine, when you prove to us, number one, that you can stop terrorism for 5 or 6 continuous years. No more terrorism for 5 years, we'll talk about a state. And how about you get rid of the corrupt Fatah? And therefore, we'll trace the money we give you, and we'll see if you're accountable for it. Is it getting to your people? Or is the reason they're starving because Arafat and his fat buddies in Fatah have been stealing it? I mean, is that how Mrs. Arafat got the 2 or 3 bill that she's living off in the south of France? You know they're crooks. Joe, I mean, you know, they made more than you made. I mean, you sold your office for a lot, but you were in the millions, they were in the billions. And maybe this is a chance to put that behind you. This would be a remarkable thing. I mean, this would be like, I hate to use the expression, Nixon going to China. If you were to make an abrupt change of policy here and say, I've had enough. I've just had enough. I can see through all this. We're going to change the game. No Palestinian state until they deserve it and until they assure us they're going to be a force for peace in the world. Right now, they're just the opposite. And by no means an agreement with the regime of terror that has more blood on its hands than any country but China. No agreement with them to be in a position where they can destroy large parts of the world. And at the same time, take in our money to kill our friends and to kill us. It's not hard, Joe. It'd do you good. Do you a lot of good. And it certainly is in the best interest of your countrymen. So I don't have great hope that it's going to work, but I've seen stranger things happen. And it is so clear. it is so clear that we are right now really at war with Iran. Take Hamas out. Take Israel out, because that's what Iran wants to do. This is Iran testing for what is surely going to be, at some point, a massive attack by much more sophisticated forces on the state of Israel. Well, thank you for listening in. We'll be back in a few days. And remember, we're very fortunate people. We live in the freest, the fairest, and the best country on earth. And every day when we wake up, we should thank God for the blessings that he's given us. See you in a few days.